Hi, everyone. We'll be talking about emerging responses to the health impacts of climate change, and I would invite everyone to maybe sit down so we can start. Well, let me invite our panelists over on stage, please. So we have Dr. Martin Edlund, CEO of Malaria No More, Alice Bell, Head of Policy for Climate and Health at Wellcome Trust, and Gloria Maimela, Director of Climate and Health at the Wits Reproductive Health and HIV Institute. Okay, so let me dive in, and I hope everyone can join us as well once you've finished some of your drinks and food. I think, well, early this week we've had Health Day, and everyone's been talking about how historic it's been. After 27 years, finally, health is on the agenda of COP, right? And everyone's saying health is the face of the climate change crisis. I think we've all heard kind of really how much climate change affects health, but I do want to talk at this panel about some of the solutions that we're looking at and some of the ways we're tackling some of these challenges. So maybe I'll start with Martin. So one of the threats posed by climate change and changing weather patterns is the spread of infectious diseases. And that one of the things that we've been hearing about is malaria. How is the malaria community preparing for this to help mitigate a potential increase in malaria infections and deaths? And maybe you can talk about dengue as well.
Happy to. All the mosquito diseases, give them all to me. So, we're really facing a perfect storm of challenges in global health, including actual storms and floods. But we've got conflict, competition for resources, growing costs, and of course, climate. And as we'll talk about on the panel, there are a broad range of impacts of climate on health. But I do think mosquito-borne diseases are maybe a good canary or mosquito in the coal mine because they are so sensitive to small changes in temperature, rainfall, humidity, et cetera. And of course, we're not seeing small changes. We're seeing really dramatic changes to the conditions that spread these diseases. We're seeing changing rainfall patterns. We're seeing lengthening rainy seasons. So oftentimes there's no break between kind of the on and the off season for a disease like dengue or malaria. We're seeing, due to warming, the mosquitoes that transmit these diseases going to new latitudes and new altitudes and exposing naive populations. And then, of course, we're seeing extreme weather events, flooding events that cause outbreaks. And, it was mentioned earlier, the flooding in Pakistan last year. I think that was probably the single extreme weather event that really arrested the world's attention on health. 2-3 weeks after the disaster of the flooding that put 30% of the landmass underwater, we had the slow motion disaster of the extreme health crisis that followed the extreme weather event. So we saw dengue and malaria outbreaks and cholera outbreaks. Malaria grew 400% in the wake of the flooding. Dengue grew 900% in Pakistan. And it's not like everything else was held constant. In fact, communities were stranded on inland islands where, maybe it used to be a 15-minute walk to the clinic. Now, all of a sudden, they had to commandeer a boat. It took an hour to get to a clinic that, had a 200 or 300% surge in people coming. And so, we're facing what is likely to be the worst dengue year on record. It already is in places like Bangladesh and Brazil. It's a 73% increase in dengue this year. And in terms of malaria, and the latest World Malaria Report was launched here on Health Day at COP28. The malaria story is a success story over the last 20 years. We've seen 13 million lives saved, 2 billion cases averted, $2 trillion in economic benefits for some of the poorest communities on the planet. But we're now at a point where we risk losing 20 years of health gains, extreme poverty gains, and really putting our goals, like eliminating malaria, out of reach due to the pressures of climate change.
Just building on that, you mentioned about success story, and I think over this past few years we've had like WHO recommended 2 malaria vaccines, right?
Yeah.
But what are some of the initiatives that are out there? Are these enough? Having these vaccines.
Yeah.
I think Malaria No More is supporting like forecasting tools. Are these enough, or what else is needed to kind of prepare ourselves for this, further spread of these diseases?
I'm really glad for part 2 of this question because I felt like I was pretty doom and gloom in the first part of that answer. So while the challenge is getting a lot harder due to climate change and other factors, the solutions are getting better. I've been at this for 17 years, and there's never been a moment in those 17 years where there's been simultaneously such kind of risk and peril and promise. And it's because of the technology pipeline and some of the innovations we're seeing. So let me give 2 quick examples, one for malaria, one for dengue. One that focuses on people and how you protect them from climate pressures, and one that focuses on the mosquito. So in malaria, we're seeing a lot of variability due to climate change, and it's making it harder to kind of test and treat and do the routine things that we normally see. But there's a really simple and profound innovation called seasonal malaria chemoprevention, which is a mouthful. But essentially, it's a $1.50 pill given to the most vulnerable audiences, children under 5, once a month. And it's caused a 75% reduction in clinical malaria cases. So right now, 49 million kids benefit. We just did an analysis with the Global Fund that showed that as many as 350 million kids could benefit according to the WHO recommendation. So now to the mosquito. So on the dengue side, we talked about all the challenges, reaching new audiences and so forth. But there's a really cool technology, and it's actually something Wellcome Trust has been supporting the research for quite a while, a naturally occurring bacteria called Wolbachia. And if you infect the mosquitoes with this, a randomized control trial in Indonesia showed it can cause a 77% reduction in dengue cases. This is a one-time intervention. You raise these Wolbachia-infected mosquitoes, you release them into the wild, it permeates in the wild population. It doesn't kill the mosquitoes, it has no other adverse effects. Again, it's naturally occurring in insects, but it shuts down not only dengue, but a whole class of what we call arboviruses. So dengue, Zika, chikungunya, yellow fever. And we're looking forward to a WHO recommendation on that soon. And then a lot of countries, as they faced their worst dengue year in history, want to roll out these kind of technologies.
How soon? Because I've been hearing about this, like we're going to get the recommendation from WHO. Is it happening before the year ends? Or?
It's not happening before the year end. What I'm told is end of Q1, but I was told end of Q1 at the start of this year. So we need to see that happen.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to get back to you on how we can scale this up and other things about finance. But I do want to ask Alice, Wellcome has been funding research on how to mitigate or reduce the impact of climate change on health. Can you talk about some of the exciting research projects you're supporting, and why is Wellcome doing this?
Why is Wellcome doing this? Well, Wellcome is doing this because the climate crisis is a health crisis. And there's 2 sides to that. One is that so much of the health sector is acting as if we're living in static temperatures. And I was saying this to some people the other day. It was at a WHO WMO event. And they were both celebrating how old the WHO is and how old the WMO is, so both the World Health Organization and the World Meteorological Organization. We have not been living in static temperatures since well before not only the WHO was founded, but the WMO. Now, we're only really feeling that in a very, very obvious way the last few decades, but we are feeling it in a really obvious way. Like, I remember being in Europe in the summer of 2003 and being, oh wow, this is the heat. This is the heat wave that I was told as a child was going to come if we didn't tackle climate change. And I know a scientist who was by then he was already a very eminent scientist, and he was also apparently that summer on holiday with his wife and boring his wife by saying, this is the heat. That's 20 years ago. We've been living like this for 20 years, and it's getting to a crisis point. And the health sector is woefully underprepared in some places. It's absolutely terrifying. So Wellcome is partly engaging this space as a health organization to be a leader in saying we, like other health organizations around the world, need to be thinking about how all of the investments and programs and ideas and plans that we're making for how we're going to eradicate this disease or tackle inequality in this area or save lives here reflects the fact that we are having all of the challenges that come with the climate crisis. But the second side of it is that the climate debate has missed health. And I I think we could be getting to a really dangerous point in terms of decision making on climate, where we weigh stuff up in terms of carbon, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We don't just think about carbon now, we're thinking about the super pollutants, but we're weighing it up in terms of this sort of geochemistry, which is vital, it's central to it, and we're thinking about global temperatures, so we've got the meteorology, and then we've got the economic case and weighing up the dollars moving around the world, but we're forgetting the impact on human lives. And we could end up making decisions which seem very sensible in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and money, but are creating new risks. And we know that when we create new risks, it's probably the people who are already marginalized and vulnerable that are going to have to absorb those risks. So when we think about adaptation policies, this word in climate policy of maladaptation, of adaptation policies that we do but actually cause other problems, we know it's more likely to be women and other marginalized groups that are most likely to be affected by that. So for me, as a climate person, going to Wellcome, I joined about 18 months ago. One of the reasons I joined the program is that I am terrified about the trajectory of climate policy if we don't include health. And one of the beautiful things this week, and why I'm in a relatively good mood for halfway through a COP, relatively, is that Health Day was, I think, really successful, and I think has helped make the case to the climate sector about what health brings. It's not just health needs to think about its own issues in health systems, but that we have got some really strong evidence and ideas about how to make climate action faster and to how to make climate action better. And then quickly to answer your other question about what I'm excited in.
Exciting research projects.
So
Just one or two, maybe.
there is, sorry?
Just one or two.
Well, I'm very quick. I'm going to say that I'm very excited about all of our portfolio, which includes infectious disease and heat. So we have people representing them on the table. But also, just because we haven't got anyone here on mental health, but it has been a big issue here at COP, is that I'm really excited by one of the projects that we're doing at Imperial College called Connecting Climate Minds. You might well have seen them around COP. And thinking about how we need to build a new research agenda to understand what are the multiple challenges when it comes to mental health and climate, because it's not just climate anxiety, it is huge. And mental health is a really interesting vector to think about health and climate, because you see just the huge diversity of issues that we have to look at. And the thing that really excites me, though, across all of it is not just the what we're researching, but the how. And that if we're going to have really good health research for the climate crisis, we need to do science differently. We need to be connecting scientists to policymakers. We need to be funding transdisciplinary research that gets people together. And that's the thing that probably drives me more excitingly than the what.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's a really, really good research area, right? Not everyone really understands how, I mean, everyone says, you know, it's important mental health, but we need some data, we need some research, and that's really a really good area to fund and get some more information. I do want to go to Gloria, because you're doing some really good research about, you know, the impacts of climate on maternal health and maternal health. I was reading something, I think something I heard this week about pregnant women are likely to deliver early when it's too hot. And I think not everyone really understands some of these things or kind of realize just how heat is affecting our bodies and everything else. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what is known and not known at the moment when it comes to climate change impacts on maternal and child health, and what are you seeing in your work?
So through our work, we've conducted what we call systematic reviews. And those systematic reviews have shown that there is a link between heat exposure and adverse outcomes in pregnant women and children. So for example, we've seen that women who are exposed to high ambient temperatures tend to have what we call preeclampsia or pregnancy hypertension. They also are at risk of developing diabetes mellitus, which is gestational diabetes. But we've also seen from the other side that there's a strong link between heat exposure and preterm birth, low birth weight, as well as even stillbirth in pregnant women. So we know definitely that there is a risk when women are exposed to high ambient temperature. And this is from direct impacts of heat exposure. We also, if we look at the indirect impacts, for example, with climate change and exposure to heat, we have food insecurity. And you can imagine food insecurity and its impact on growing children, which can be devastating. Also, the climate-sensitive diseases, as we've mentioned, malaria in pregnancy tends to be, women with malaria tend to have more complications than before. So we know that there's definitely a link. we're still investigating, what we're trying, so what research has done is that we've done association studies that says, hang on, there is a link between heat exposure and adverse outcomes. What we're trying to also hone in is to the attribution, because we want to be able to say if a woman has delivers prematurely, we know that there are other factors that can cause premature birth. So we want to be able to say to what extent does climate change contribute to this problem, instead of just a blanket approach to saying that everything is because of climate change, because we know that the solutions are multifactorial. So the attribution studies will be zooming in to see exactly to what extent is climate change a problem. Then the last part is we need to be able to understand the pathophysiology. Like, why is it that when a woman is exposed to high ambient temperature, she ends up with preterm delivery? And we think that it has to do with the inflammatory markers in your body that then tend to result in early labor. So therefore, that's some of the studies, that's what we don't know yet. And we've been fortunately funded by the Wellcome Trust, one of our bioheat studies, to look specifically into that.
Yeah, I think it's just to repeat, it's interesting when we think we know so much about the impacts of climate change on health, and we still don't know much, right? But I just want to follow up on what you mentioned. Are there things already being done to kind of address some of these things that are affecting women, pregnant women, in South Africa, for instance?
Yeah, you see, most of the data has been, generated from the northern countries, and there's been scarcity of data from the African region, and we're trying to change that, and that's why we're leading some of the studies from the south. But we've already conducted some of the studies, for example, in Kenya and Burkina Faso, where we've shown that by simply increasing awareness about the impact of heat on pregnancy outcomes has actually led to behavioral changes. For example, in Kenya, women used to walk for miles to go fetch water, something as simple as water, and that was exposing them to high ambient temperature, and we've seen the outcomes. And through focus group discussions, through qualitative research, we're able to discuss the impact, to raise awareness about the risks of climate health, to bring in their partners and their extended family to support. And with the dialogues that began from there were, suddenly male partners were now stepping in to assist. They were kind of like understanding that, there are risks in certain occupations or gender-related occupations that were putting their wives at risk. And by just that simple solution, we started seeing changes in that environment. And those are the kind of interventions that we are scaling throughout the African region.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to go back to Martin and talk about, scaling up some of the things you mentioned. SMC, you talk about Wolbachia. I know that I was speaking to Peter Sands the other day, and I know that they're channeling 70% of their funding over the next 3 years to 50 most climate vulnerable countries.
Yep.
Right? And one of the things that they're really focusing on is malaria. But I do want to talk about how can we scale up some of these solutions that you mentioned.
It's going to take money, right? We need to invest if we want to scale up. Let me contrast two numbers. So there's an excellent study by the World Bank that shows that by the end of the decade, 132 million people could be driven into extreme poverty by the impacts of climate change. And when they actually dig in and look at the drivers, what's causing that, climate's impact on health is the single biggest driver, accounting for fully a third of those people. So 44 million people could be driven into extreme poverty by climate's impact on health. So health is a big contributor when you look at that. Now, where are we in terms of health financing in the climate conversation? So I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you quickly. Hopefully these will land. So a study just came out from the Climate Policy Initiative that showed that we've doubled climate spending in the last year. That's great news, right? We're up to $1.3 trillion being spent per year. But when you look at adaptation, as we heard about on earlier panels, it's a very small percentage. Slightly less than 5% of that is spent on adaptation. Health is much smaller still. So health, the estimate kind of coming into this year was that about 0.5% of climate financing is going to health. So on the one hand, we're seeing climate's impact on health responsible for driving a third of the people into extreme poverty. On the other hand, we're spending 0.5% of climate financing on health. Now, we did have Health Day this year. we saw a great announcement, $1 billion
yeah.
committed. Wellcome Trust was a part of that, along with the Asian Development Bank, Green Climate Fund, Rockefeller Foundation, and a number of others. $1 billion isn't nearly enough for the scale of the challenge. And so the thing I'm most excited about is seeing the pipelines built between funders. So I'm an ambassador for the Global Fund, so do a lot of work with Peter and his team. And they announced this week an MOU with the World Bank to co-invest on climate and health. The World Bank spends about $6 billion a year on health, so they can work together. They also announced an MOU with the Green Climate Fund. So, the Global Fund has $15.5 billion, the Green Climate Fund has $13.5 billion, and now they're starting to look at common pipeline and common investment strategies. And so the real measure of success here is not going to be how much money flows, but what are the impacts from that. And if we spend the money well, if we learn as we go and refine our approaches, we can save millions, potentially tens of millions of lives from climate's impact on health now, and we can invest in a way that's going to reduce the CO2 footprint, speed the energy transition, and frankly save billions of future lives by arresting warming.
That's a good thing, unlocking more money, not just beyond the 1 billion we're hearing this week. Alice, Wellcome is, I think, one, if not the only, funders of climate and health research. Can you talk about how we can kind of unlock more funding in that area?
So we're not the only funder of climate and health research, but it is striking that whenever I meet a climate and health researcher, they will have some money from us. And if we go to events on climate and health, it's actually getting slightly embarrassing how many people around the table thank us. And I want us to get to a point where people don't notice me in the room as Wellcome, because Wellcome doesn't need to be noticed. We are one of those philanthropies that is in the beneficial situation where we don't really need to show off our brand. And really what we want to see is the impact in the world, and that impact will be many other funders. So we need to give people like my friends on the panel a diversity of options about where they're going to go to get money, but also more money. Because as Martin said, this billion is nothing compared to what we need. And I think the thing that I found when we came in to doing more work in the climate and health field and saying, well, we're going to put 100 million a year pounds into this, that's a start. Who else is going to also come to the table? We might be thinking about, well, how are we going to lobby other groups and how we encourage them? How do we use a bit of a carrot of like, look how great this is? And the thing I found is the most powerful is just, we have been funding really fascinating research, and so many other research funders are going, I want to have a bit of that pie. So we are increasingly finding that the NIH, the EU, the other philanthropies, like, we want to fund this. And they all already, it's a great NIH program on climate and health, there's a great EU program on climate and health, lots of other philanthropies. Rockefeller, for example, are really investing in the space. But I'm really hopeful that by this time next year, people won't be just coming up and thanking Wellcome all the time. They'll have a diversity of people to thank. And we'll also have so many more researchers working because of that. Because one of the things that we've been doing with this research is opening up all the other areas of research. Like we were hearing about the importance of learning about attribution. There is so much work to be done understanding the problem and then working out the solutions.
Yeah. One of the things that you pointed out earlier, I think it's Gloria or Alice, is about, I think it's Gloria, about there's so much data, but it's based on the global north countries, right? We don't have a lot of data in the global south. I think when it comes to funding, there's always this also discussion about, are global south countries getting that? Are those in the global south accessing those funding? So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, Gloria. Is it easy, or why funders should do more of that in the global south?
Yeah, I mean, Africa is disproportionately affected by climate change. So it has the least resources to cope with climate change, and therefore we need more data to be coming from the global south, so to speak, to be able to inform some of the solutions that are contextual to the region. And therefore we need more investment in research that is led by the global south. And also one of the other interesting aspects from the global south is also tapping into indigenous knowledge. And people have kind of like been, not, focusing on that. Getting into the African, the African region, understanding what works so that when we, by the time we come up with, we talk about co-creation of solutions and not just us coming up with the answers. So we go into the communities and we kind of like tap into their knowledge about what they know and to what extent this helps with adaptation. And then how do we meet each other halfway, because we know that that increases acceptability of the interventions that are coming. So generating that knowledge, generating that data from Africa or the global south is extremely important. And I'm going to refer again to the Wellcome Trust, is that they've actually been prioritizing studies that are led. For example, for myself, I lead some of the studies from low middle income countries going forward. Yeah.
Well, what I'm going to do is open the panel for questions from our audience. If you have any questions before I continue.
There's a question over
Definitely have one over here.
Oh.
Hi everyone, my name is Josephine and I work with Afrobarometer. We are a research network in Africa. We've done surveys in up to about 42 African countries, and we've been doing this since 1999. What she said just really hits me, and I just a few seconds to pitch into what she just said. We have very interesting findings on everything that affects the everyday lives of Africans, including climate change. So we just recently published our data on climate change, and it covers about 39 African countries. And it shows that significant proportions of Africans are experiencing deteriorating weather conditions, especially floods and droughts. And those who are particularly more likely to report these are those who work in the agricultural sector, poor citizens, and those who work in the rural residents. Now, when it comes to awareness, in spite of everything that we keep saying about climate change, only half of Africans say they are aware of this phenomenon. And awareness is particularly low among the least educated, of course, but also among poor citizens, among rural residents, and among women. Now, when it comes to the effects of climate change, we have about 3/4 of those who are aware of climate change saying that climate change is making lives in their countries worse. And when it comes to their views on climate actions, their expectations of climate actions, they're expecting their governments to do a lot more. Yeah. And they are demanding action now, even if it comes at a cost, even if it's expensive. But they also admit that the citizens themselves have a part to play when it comes to mitigating climate change. Now, we have very interesting findings, and if you look at the QR codes here, you can just scan them. You see a very nice video that's summarizing the findings, and then you can also see our publication. So we can continue this conversation after.
Do you have any questions, Josephine, or is more of a comment?
No, I just needed to pitch in.
Oh, okay, thank you.
We have a chair up here.
I do have a question. I know she completely, hijacked the,
Yes.
the panel.
Yes.
But the question is how do we find synergies between the organizations that are there, because we have findings on health, and how do we bring the African perspective to the global conversations at COP28? So that's why we're here, and we want to look at those partnerships and synergies.
Right. Martin, you want to start?
So I think it's such an important point, and I actually think putting health at the center of climate action and investment can be a positive tipping point. I think it can really change not just the health conversation, but the climate conversation. So we launched a campaign this week with Time Magazine, Snapchat, and a number of other partners that's called The Face of Change. And it's about how do we elevate those stories of frontline communities that are impacted. We're working with 650 civil society groups across sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And these stories are happening every day. And what we're seeing with these local community activists is that once they start to look at climate through the lens of their health, it becomes personal, it becomes visceral, it becomes actionable in a way that climate out there doesn't. And so we're excited about this. It's the start of a journey. Anyone who wants to be involved would love to work with our friends who just made the comments. You can go to faceofchange.org to see that, and there's a lot of work to do.
Any more? Yes, please. Oh, first and then you.
Hi, my name is Karina Weinstein, and I work for FXB USA. I lead the FXB Climate Advocates Program, that works to empower young people, youth advocates with climate solutions. One of the things that we noticed in our cohorts of youth advocates across the globe, global north and global south, that eco-anxiety is a really prevalent mental health consequence of climate change. And of course, for our youth from the global south, there's very direct lived experience with actually impact on physical health, whether it's through food insecurity, respiratory issues, etc. So my question to all of you is, how can young people be advocates for climate and health?
Alice, and then Gloria.
Young people are already being great advocates for climate and health, and I've seen that across so many of the climate and health events that I've been at this week, and also on the lead up to it. So one of the reasons why we've had the success that we've had has been quite a lot of health expertise that is coming through. And I want to emphasize that this is health expertise that is coming with the youth voices as well. They are bringing a generational voice, but many of them are trained doctors, training in other kind of areas of health professions, or just have a real interest and a real knowledge. They bring lived experience as well. And I also want to note, just like you said, there's climate anxiety on one side, and then you said physical health too. It's not just climate anxiety as a mental health impact. There are a lot of people already suffering a range of mental health impacts. And mental health often intersects with a lot of physical health things. And one of the most shocking things I heard this week, in terms of just to bring that example to life, was in the heat dome that hit British Columbia the summer before last, 8% of the deaths were people with schizophrenia, which is way above the average number of people who have schizophrenia in the population there. And that is an example of how people with mental health as well as physical health conditions are suffering the impacts of climate health much, much worse. And that is the sort of thing that you're hearing. Actually, I heard that stat in a youth event. We're hearing it in the Youth Justice Champion space. We're hearing it with Youngo. We're hearing it with UNICEF. They already are, and I'm really excited to build on it more in the year ahead.
Right. Before Gloria, I just want to give the woman in front a chance to ask her question, and then we can build on it.
Hi, thanks, panelists. My name is Toba, and I'm working at FHI 360, and we are partner with the Devex Summit today. For those who don't know FHI 360, we work in over 60 countries, and we have a very strong global health portfolio. Now, but I'm a climate scientist. And I've been going to COP, and I've been on the climate side. And for the past few years, I kind of migrating into the health side. Now, my question is that when I look at the space of health and climate people in that joint space, where do you think NGOs like FHI 360 and many others in the room would really leverage our evidence, research, data, already in the health space and in the climate space? If you look at GCF, for example, how many projects in GCF that funds health NGOs or development NGOs working in the climate space? Wellcome Trust. I know that you talk about research, and we believe that we have that knowledge to action kind of role. Where do you think NGO like FHI 360 can, tap the resources, bring the evidence to policies and actions?
I can give a very quick answer to that for the Wellcome funding option, and then let others speak, which is that we had a call last year on demonstrating the health impacts of climate change, and that will happen year on year. So that you can look out on our website. There'll be another version of that call in a few months. It's health impacts of climate change, and we welcome NGOs collaborating with researchers or who are researchers themselves applying to that call. When we say we fund research, that doesn't just mean that we fund universities. And one of the benefits of us as a philanthropy as opposed to other research funders is that we would really welcome that kind of transdisciplinary work where we have people who are actioning the work as well as people who are studying the problem. So look out for the impacts call. It'll be out soon.
Right. Gloria, do you want to respond to the question on youth?
Yeah, two things. So eco-anxiety is very real, especially among the youth, and how we are trying to address this, we try to get them to be part of the solution. So for example, in my team, I've recruited young people who we call carbon emission interns, and they've become the change agents. They're going out there, spreading the word, looking for solutions, and because they're involved, well, it goes to an extent in terms of lessening anxiety. FHI 360, we've had the privilege of in the HIV space, working with organizations like that. And I think how we can work together is, supporting each other, particularly for building climate resilient health systems. I think that's where you come in. Also, technological solutions to some of the interventions that we're looking at. I mean, I think there are many, many other ways that we could collaborate and find solutions together. Thank you.
We're very much over time, but thank you so much to our great panelists and also to our audience who asked the question and listened in. Thank you so much. Can we please give a hand to our panelists here?